Colleagues, let's start our next point of the agenda. Sono still exchange of view with Mr. Draghi, but now in his capacity as chair of the European Systemic Risk Board. I recall that the last such exchange in November raised some very interesting issues on shadow banking, on so-called misconduct risk, on other issues, and the chair promised us at that point a report on the regulatory treatment of sovereign debt exposures, and he has delivered on this with a publication that has been circulated to all ECON members. So thank you again, President Draghi, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, honorable members of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to update this committee on the work of the European Systemic Risk Board in my capacity as chair of that body. The potential for widespread financial distress remains one of the main threats to economic recovery. The ESRB plays a key role in mitigating the risk of disruption to the financial system in the European Union. In this sense, the activities of the ESRB, developing structural and cyclical macroprudential policies and coordinating their implementation across the EU, ultimately help to improve the welfare of European citizens. Today, I would like to focus on two important developments. First, I'll give an overview of the many substantial macroprudential policy measures that have been taken in the EU since the new capital rules for banks became applicable 15 months ago. Second, I will discuss the ESRB's recently published report on the regulatory treatment of sovereign exposures. I'll then conclude by highlighting ongoing work regarding the macroprudential framework for non-banks. The Capital Requirements Directive and Regulation, which became applicable at the beginning of 2014, represented a landmark innovation for macroprudential policy in the European Union. The rules gave authorities a new set of policy instruments with which to address financial stability risks. In addition, under the rules, the ESRB was charged with new tasks, such as developing guidance on the use of certain instruments, as it did for the counter-cyclical capital buffer in June last year, and issuing opinions on the use of instruments, as it has done for a measure taken by the Belgian Central Bank regarding real estate lending. When I appeared before this committee in November, I referred to some early developments in the use of macroprudential instruments. Now that the new capital rules have been in force for more than 1 year, I can paint a more detailed picture. Since the beginning of 2014, about 45 new macroprudential policy measures have been taken in the European Union, under the guidance provided by the ESRB in its flagship report and in its handbook on macroprudential policy in the banking sector. This list includes the activation of capital instruments available under the CRD and CRR, as well as other instruments available under national legislation, such as loan-to-value limits. In addition, another 45 minor administrative measures have been issued. The ESRB publishes a catalogue of all 90 measures on its website. This catalogue, which is updated periodically, reflects the ESRB's role as a central hub for information regarding macroprudential policy in the EU. Let me give you an impression of the content of these new macroprudential policy measures. Around half of the 90 measures have economic substance. The remainder, such as the early introduction of the capital conservation buffer or the setting of a counter-cyclical capital buffer rate at 0%, are of a more administrative and procedural nature. Roughly half of the 90 measures have been taken by just 4 member states: Denmark, Slovakia, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Some member states did not take any measure in 2014, including France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and Spain. The large majority of measures are of a tightening or conservation nature. Most of them, about 85%, aim to address concerns related to the credit growth and leverage. The remaining measures tackle systemic risks arising from banking groups that are large and complex. A number of member states introduced measures aimed at maintaining the regulatory capital levels that existed before the CRD and CRR entered into force. Other measures are not yet binding, but this may change as the financial cycle develops. The real estate sector features prominently in the measures taken. For example, in terms of adjustments to the risk weights applicable to real estate lending, as well as loan-to-value and loan-to-income limits, this wide variety of measures is quite normal, since macroprudential policy is still at an early phase of development. In this spirit, the ESRB is conducting further work on the use of macroprudential instruments to address potential systemic risks emanating from real estate. At my next hearing, I intend to provide greater detail on the outcome of this work. In discussing these measures with national authorities, the ESRB has observed that the analysis of possible cross-border effects is usually limited. Furthermore, national measures are reciprocated by other member states only rarely. Let me make here 2 examples. First, I'd like to congratulate the authorities of the Netherlands for having decided to reciprocate the above-mentioned measures of the National Bank of Belgium, through which risk weights on certain mortgages in Belgium have been temporarily increased. Thanks to this reciprocation decision, Dutch banks lending to residents in Belgium will be subject to the same macroprudential conditions. Second, last year, Estonia imposed a systemic risk buffer on its own banks to tackle certain structural vulnerabilities and invited the macroprudential authorities of Northern Europe to reciprocate, to avoid that its measures would be bypassed through lending from large foreign banks. Discussions are still ongoing, and I would urge authorities of other countries to take that request in serious consideration. I believe that reciprocation is useful as it fosters a level playing field and reduces the risk of the effectiveness of measures being eroded by the activities of foreign banks. We need to ensure that the financial stability policies of the member states across the European Union are uniformly applied when they address the same vulnerabilities in the same regions. Accordingly, the ESRB is investigating these issues more closely, also in order to hardwire voluntary reciprocation procedures among ESRB members. Now, I would like to turn to a specific topic of substantial macroprudential policy interest: the regulatory treatment of sovereign exposures. In recent years, we have seen that substantial systemic risk can arise from the link between banks and sovereigns. With this in mind, the ESRB has been working for more than 2 years to critically assess the treatment of sovereign risk in regulation. Earlier this month, the ESRB published its detailed findings. Sovereign exposures are in many ways treated preferentially compared with corporate exposures in current banking and insurance regulation. For example, sovereign exposures are exempt from large exposure regime and are often subject to low or even zero capital requirements. The report argues that such rules underestimate the possibility of sovereign default and therefore do not fully reflect the risks associated with sovereign exposures. Preferential treatment can therefore lead to systemic risks arising from overinvestment in government debt, crowding out of lending to the economy, and the reinforcement of bank sovereign link. At the same time, the report also stresses that any changes to the current framework must be carefully designed and calibrated in order to set the right incentives for financial institutions without increasing procyclicality or creating instability in the sovereign bond market. It examines a number of policy options which could be implemented on their own or in combination with other policies. These policy options include increasing capital requirements for sovereign exposures and applying large exposure limits. The policy options are examined in terms of their advantages and their disadvantages, as well as their possible impact on financial institutions and markets. I would like to emphasize that the report is concerned with ensuring financial stability in the long term, not with addressing any immediate difficulties. Also, it is necessary to achieve progress at the international level on the same issues. The policy options presented in the report would only be implemented once the situation in sovereign bond markets has normalized and in the framework of a review of the Basel Accord. Indeed, the ESRB report will be a useful reference point not only in Europe but also in global institutions such as the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which has recently initiated a review of the parts of the Basel Accord related to sovereign risk. I therefore trust that the report will help to foster a discussion which, in my view, is long overdue. Mr. Chair, honourable members, let me conclude with some general reflections on macroprudential policy. Since the ESRB was established towards the end of 2010, macroprudential policy has come a long way. Responsibilities have been assigned to macroprudential authorities across the EU following the ESRB's recommendation in 2011. Thanks to the Capital Requirements Directive and regulation, these macroprudential authorities have been given substantial powers. Macroprudential policy making is now alive and kicking, as is apparent from the 90 measures which have been taken in just over 1 year. The ESRB continues to reflect not only the macroprudential policy stance, but also on whether the macroprudential policy framework is adequate. This includes structural topics such as the regulatory treatment of sovereign exposures. It also includes the extension of macroprudential policy to non-banks, which play an increasingly important role in Europe's financial system. The ESRB is progressing with work on developing macroprudential policies for financial market activities and non-bank financial entities, including shadow banks. Let me give you one example. The ESRB is aware that the systemic risk of vicious liquidity spirals, whereby funding and market liquidity interact, generating contagion, still exists. To mitigate this systemic risk, macroprudential authorities could consider setting conservative minimum or time-varying margin requirements in order to reduce the risk of a sudden increase in margin requirements. Such a macroprudential policy could be applied both to over-the-counter and centrally cleared transactions. Although this work is at an early stage, I believe it has the potential to be an important extension of the macroprudential policy framework. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look now to answering your question.
Thank you very much, President Draghi. Now we start our question and answer slot. I have to ask colleagues we should stick to 4 minutes, not a 5-minute slot, in order to allow President Draghi to take his plane back to Frankfurt in time. And the first speaker is Georgios Kritsos, EPP Group.
Ευχαριστώ κύριε Πρόεδρε. Συνδέοντας την προηγούμενη συζήτηση για την κατάσταση του ελληνικού τραπεζικού συστήματος, θεωρώ ότι το τραπεζικό σύστημα στην Ελλάδα αντιμετωπίζει τεράστια προβλήματα για δεύτερη φορά. Την πρώτη φορά έπεσε έξω το δημόσιο και κούρεψε τα ομόλογα, οπότε απέκτησε το τραπεζικό σύστημα που δεν πήγαινε άσχημα, ήταν αρκετά καλό, μεγάλο πρόβλημα. Και τώρα οι κακές οικονομικές εξελίξεις και το κλίμα αστάθειας μειώνουν τις καταθέσεις, αυξάνουν τα δάνεια που δεν εξυπηρετούνται και υπάρχει και η αγωνία των ελληνικών τραπεζών μήπως αλλάξουν οι κανόνες για τον λεγόμενο αναβαλώμενο φόρο και χρειαστούν μεγαλύτερη ανακεφαλαιοποίηση. Επομένως, συνδέοντας και το προηγούμενο ερώτημα του κυρίου Βάιτσέκερ, πώς σκέπτεστε να αντιμετωπίσετε αυτές τις δυσκολίες που εγώ πιστεύω ότι δεν οφείλονται τόσο στις αδυναμίες του ελληνικού τραπεζικού συστήματος, αλλά στις γενικότερες δυσλειτουργίες του οικονομικού και πολιτικού συστήματος.
I certainly agree with you. Greek banks are this time in a much better state than they were on occasion of the last crisis. We have to look at Greek banks under two dimensions. The first is the solvency aspect. Greek banks are, at the present, they are solvent. All three indicators, the common equity tier 1 ratio, the tier 1, and the total capital ratio of the Greek banks are all above the harmonized regulatory minima, both on a solo and on a consolidated basis. So the Greek banks are currently compliant with those minimum regulatory requirements. At the same time, liquidity situation has been, exactly because of what you said, has been deteriorating. And there, the Greek banks' dependence on ECB funding has increased. And here, I think the answer is the same I was giving before. It's absolutely necessary that the Greek authorities and the Eurogroup members establish jointly a process that could recreate the policy dialogue so that this would enable all parties, including the ECB, to reach that situation which I described as one where there is a reasonable assessment for the likelihood of a successful conclusion of the review. Thank you.
Thank you. Now for the S&T Group, Kostas Mavridis.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. President, I'd like to ask you a question that relates the public statements made by key figures in European public offices, by officers in European public offices, such as the Eurogroup, for example. Recently, we had a statement that regarding Greece was based on the statement the Cyprus bailout model, or bail-in, to be correct, bail-in, could be implemented as a way regarding the Greek banking system. Now, I do remember very well that in 2013, when the first Eurogroup agreed on the first so-called bail-in that included a levy on the insured deposits, the European Central Bank made a public statement later on correcting and revoking that. I wonder, and I'd like to know your comment, how such statements, not by you of course, but by others, can contribute towards the systemic risk. And one last question. There is a lot of discussion recently in Cyprus about the sale of the Cyprus bank branches in Greece to a specific bank in Greece, and whether that was done in an arm's length manner, in a fair manner. Thank you.
On the first point, I frankly have no comment other than because I don't know exactly the context in which those statements were made. I'm aware of that statement, of course. And I don't know what was the context in which that statement was made. Certainly the intention was not to be causing, to be aggravating the systemic risk. And certainly the ECB has not made any such a comment, and I can assure will not make any such a comment. On the other point you raised, first of all, let's remember that the ECB in all this was not an actor, it was an observer in this process. Second, it was quite clear that the financial sector for Cyprus was simply too big with respect to the size of the real economy of Cyprus. So at that point in time, the authorities decided that the sale of the Greek branches of Cyprus banks was something that ought to be undertaken. And that's the only thing I know at this point about this. But keep in mind that the ECB was simply an observer in all this process.
Would you allow me 10 seconds?
Thank you.
Just 10 seconds. Mr. President, I take your first comment that it is 100% certain that your statement regarding what happened in the first Eurogroup was the right one about the facts.
Sorry, I'm not sure I actually understand this.
The statement you made on the 4th of April 2013 about what happened in the Eurogroup at that time regarding Cyprus was the correct, and you still stay by that statement, meaning that you revoked the ECR, the European Central Bank, consider the first Eurogroup decision that imposed a levy on the insured deposits as something illegal, and that's why it was revoked.
Well, I'm not in a position to comment on what happened at that time, simply because I don't have a clear recollection of the events, but I can have you receiving a written response on this point, certainly.
Thank you. Now for the ECR group, Stanislav Ozok.
Panie Przewodniczący, Panie Prezesie, w związku z obecną sytuacją ekonomiczną nurtuje mnie kilka kwestii, tutaj podam tylko tych kwestii ogólnych, związanych z działalnością Europejskiej Rady do spraw ryzyka systemowego. Jak widzi Pan ewentualny podział kompetencji między Radę a instytucje nadzoru w poszczególnych państwach członkowskich w praktyce? Gdzie według Pana jest miejsce na polepszenie tej współpracy? Kolejne pytanie. Jak według Pana działa do tej pory współpraca dotycząca nadzoru finansowego, a działania poszczególnych rządów, które, jak wiemy, w praktyce nie zawsze dotrzymują zasad w kwestiach utrzymania odpowiedniej dyscypliny finansowej? Czy europejski nadzór finansowy spełnia i spełni swoją funkcję, skoro brakuje tej dyscypliny poszczególnych rządów w zakresie kontroli budżetowej? I ostatnie pytanie. Czy uważa Pan, że ryzyko systemowe może zostać usunięte lub chociaż zredukowane poprzez działania polityczne? Czy tylko będzie to przesunięcie z jednego obszaru w inny? Wiemy często z doświadczenia, że polityka i ekonomia nie zawsze mają niewiele wspólnego. Dziękuję za uwagę.
Thank you. Your questions really deal with one common theme, namely how would a greater cooperation be structured on the use of macroprudential instruments? Let me give you my impression is, and also from what I said in the statement about reciprocation, the need to have reciprocation is fundamental. My sense is that we are so integrated financially that frankly it doesn't make much sense to take these measures based only on a national perspective. it doesn't make much sense. These measures should be taken by the national authorities under the responsibility of the national authorities, or for the Eurogroup, for the Euro members, also by the ECB. You know that the responsibilities lie with both. ECB can always top up on the measures taken by the national authorities. The problem is probably more acute for the non-Euro members, because the Euro members have both the ECB and the SSM, which will look at these measures from the supervisory side, so that the likelihood of cooperation is higher. But by and large, it seems to me that there should be the utmost of cooperation in taking these measures. And so the more consultation there is, the more exchange of information, the more reciprocation there is, the better it is.
Thank you. Now for the ALDE, Cora van Nieuwenhuizen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here, Mr. Draghi. One of the consequences of the quantitative easing program is the flattening of the yield curve, and that's causing lower return on investments in fixed income instruments for some time to come. And this can particularly be problematic for pension funds and life insurers with long-term fixed liabilities. In the Netherlands, 4 of the 5 large pension funds recently announced they are unable to meet the required coverage ratio of 100%. And only last week, pension funds sounded the alarm and asked their supervisors to allow them to make changes to their investment portfolios. And if, as is expected, the period of low interest rates persists, pension funds may have to resort to lowering pension payments or raising premiums. And studies for German life insurers have also shown that solvency problems are a concern. Could you please give us your view on the impact that the QE program and long-term low interest rates can have on the stability of pension funds and life insurance throughout Europe? Thank you.
It's quite clear that you're right. The QE produced a flattening of the yield curve, the long-term maturities, which, by the way, from a monetary policy perspective, is one of the successes that we were looking at, because all real rates would fall correspondingly, and that's important for investment and growth and recovery. Having said that, you're certainly right. The situation for the pension funds and to some extent for the insurance industry is more difficult with these low rates. And each actor in that industry, so the money market funds on one hand, the pension funds on the other, the insurance companies on the other, will have their own set of problems, and they'll have to react to that. And that could actually cause, for the time being, an increase in premia. On the other hand, as the return to price stability will materialize and recovery will firm up, we will see that this situation will be overcome. That's but the bottom line is what I did say before on responding to other questions. We have a mandate, and the mandate is to reach price stability. And so the rest of the problems can be, to some extent, coped with by other measures.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, just because the question is very important and I just want to answer fully. You're certainly not suggesting that we go and raise interest rates to respond to this problem. No, I think that describes quite well the difficulty of a policy decision which is right in itself if compared with the mandate, but it can have side effects which we certainly don't want to ignore. So I'm saying you're absolutely right.
Thank you. I don't see the GUE speaker, if I'm correct. So, Sven, yeah. So it is not Marisa Matias, but...
Miguel Urbán.
Okay. We didn't have... Okay, but you can go.
Yeah. Hace 3 años, la reestructuración de la deuda griega permitió que las grandes instituciones financieras centroeuropeas redujeran drásticamente la exposición a la deuda griega, una exposición que habían adquirido de forma irresponsable y especulativa. Esta exposición se transfirió a las manos de las instituciones públicas, socializando las pérdidas a la ciudadanía europea. Durante estos años de austericidio hemos visto cómo salvan bancos, pero nunca hemos visto cómo salvan una frutería, taxis o pequeñas cooperativas, o una familia, que son las que verdaderamente construyen la economía real de un país. Hoy ustedes siguen marcándose como único objetivo de su regulación proteger al máximo los balances de las entidades financieras ante el riesgo sistémico. Mientras tanto, la deuda griega y de los países del sur no ha parado de aumentar gracias a sus políticas de austeridad y generosidad con la banca privada centroeuropea. Todo esto nos hace preguntarnos lo siguiente. ¿No considera que la posible quiebra de un país, efecto de las exigencias de la Troika, es en sí mismo un riesgo sistémico al menos tan serio como la quiebra de una entidad financiera? Y que Grecia podría ser el Lehman Brothers que llevase a la economía europea a una nueva recesión más dura de la ya experimentada y a un riesgo sistémico de orden superior. ¿No cree que la quiebra de un país conlleva un riesgo sistémico mayor para sus ciudadanos que la quiebra de cualquier banco? Tiene que comprender que detrás de sus números hay personas. Sin ir más lejos están mis vecinos que son desahuciados, despedidos de su trabajo o que se les obliga a emigrar por motivos económicos. ¿No cree que estrangular con una mano a los países del sur, como hace el Banco Central Europeo a través de la Troika, mientras con la otra, la Junta Europea de Riesgo Sistémico, busca cómo proteger al máximo los grandes capitales financieros, es gobernar únicamente en interés de las grandes finanzas y en contra de las necesidades de los pueblos de Europa? ¿No cree usted que un riesgo sistémico es en sí mismo que un banco central sin ningún tipo de control democrático se convierta en un gobierno en la sombra a favor de los grandes bancos privados, mientras considera que las quiebras de países y de sus ciudadanos tan solo como una variable externa?
Well, you seem to have strong certainties, so it's very difficult for me to convince you with my responses. But I can tell you three things. First, the bankruptcy of the previous Greek governments is not fault of the Troika. It's not fault of the ECB, which, as I said, is presently exposed for 104 billion euros. Second, at the present point in time, thanks to the QE, the OMT measures, but also to a general situation which is much more resilient than it was a few years ago when the first Greek crisis materialized, we don't think there is a systemic risk now. Now, I'm speaking for the short term. I don't know exactly what the medium-term consequences of further accidents are down the road. I don't have such a certainty for as projected in the far distant future, of course. And the third point is you question the democratic legitimacy of the ECB. We have been acting within our mandate and according to the European treaties. Thank you.
Thank you. Sven Giegold.
President Draghi, I would like to follow up on the point made by my colleague Cora from the Liberal Group on the effects of the low interest rates on systemic stability. On the 28th of February, the insurance supervisor EIOPA had to publish the ultimate forward rate, which is supposed to define the long-term risk-free interest rate. It has set this rate at 4.2% on the basis of a rationale that inflation would be a bit less than 2% and the rest would be the growth potential of Europe, although we know that currently the market rate for this, for instance, the 30-year maturity rate for the Eurozone, so the AAA bond yield curve, is only 1.48%. So on top of that, the long-term guarantee measures allow insurance companies to add another 0.17% on this rate curve. So therefore, I'm asking you, in your responsibility to ensure systemic stability, whether you regard these 4.2% as prudent. I would also like to know whether the ESRB has been involved in setting this very optimistic 4.2% rate. Third, whether you intend to take action on this matter, because if this 4.2% is not prudent, it has potentially dramatic consequences for the stability of the insurance sector and also on the livelihood of pensioners in the future. And lastly, can the ESRB commit to work on the financial stability consequences of long-term interest rates in the insurance sector as well in other sectors of the economy? I think that would be a signal to give confidence into your institution of being able to separate the mandate of the ESRB from the mandate of the Government Council of the ECB in monetary policy.
The answer to your questions are the following. We actually, at the ESRB, we made the same point you made in our risk outlook. The answer from EIOPA was that somehow that figure was the product of certain legislation. We will plan to take up this issue and do further work on this point. And on the fourth point, in the last meeting of the ESRB General Board meeting, we have decided to launch a working group on the effects that our monetary policy has on the interest rates and on the implication of maintaining low interest rates for a long time, what the implications which would be the implications on the financial industry, both banks and insurance companies and pension funds and money market funds. So I guess the credibility of the institution as being a separate body from the ECB is preserved.
If I may, just to follow up,
10 seconds for also
could you
the
be
question.
clear whether it is you regard the 4.2% as prudent or not, and whether the ESRB was involved in the decision making?
Well, I mean, certainly in the risk outlook, we made our point saying that it's certainly, let me be sort of kind here, it's a figure that needs further attention.
Please be honest, is it prudent or not?
I will not say any such a statement here. We said that we'll have to make and give further attention to this number. But as I said, we were going to work further on this point, so we'll be able to report to you and your colleagues here on the conclusions of this work. And we'll check about whether it's actually compliant with existing legislation or not. You seem to disagree with that, so we'll certainly check on that.
Yeah, we surely look forward to the conclusion of this working group. EFDD, Marco Zanni is not here, so Gerolf Annemans.
Ja, laat mij toch nog even, collega's, doorgaan op de vraag van onze groene en onze liberale collega. Ik wil het debat niet meer heropenen over de vraag of het toezicht, de functie van toezichthouder aan de ECB toeschuiven, of dat een verstandige maatregel was en wat u daarover dacht. Ik wil u dat zelf nog niet vragen. Maar het is natuurlijk wel zo dat we zeer goed weten, als u antwoordt op de functie die uw QE heeft in verband met pensioenfondsen en schaduwbankiers en verzekeraars, als u antwoordt, ja, we verwachten wel een premieverhoging wellicht, dat er ook nog andere effecten kunnen zijn. En u moet dat toch zelf beter weten dan ik. In search for yield gaan die mensen ook aandelenmarkten opzoeken, vastgoedmarkten opzoeken en gestructureerde producten opzoeken om nog aan die winsten te komen. En dus kan ik verwijzende naar uw rapport zeggen, systeemrisico's kunnen voortvloeien uit buitensporige kredietgroei en schuldfinanciering. In welke mate vindt u nu zelf niet dat, gelet op uw QE, 60 miljard per maand aan asset purchase, dat uw functie, uw cumul van functie tussen Super Mario van de ECB enerzijds en dan de rapporteur van systemische risico's anderzijds, dat die de geloofwaardigheid van uw rapport hier toch sterk ondermijnt, dat we hier echt aan de grenzen zitten van dat debat over de vraag of een toezichthouder ook centrale bankier kan zijn. U moet waarschuwen voor zeebellen die u als ECB zelf aan het blazen bent en vindt u dus zelf niet, zoal niet dat het gaat om een gigantische, dan toch tenminste om een klein beetje een spagaat die ernstige gevolgen heeft gelet op uw eigen QE. En dus kan u mij terughoudendheid begrijpen bij de voorstelling van dit rapport in verband met de systemische risico's.
I'm not sure I understand your question. You are asking whether the ESRB is credible enough as being an institution that's different from the ECB. So again, you're questioning whether the ESRB credibility stands up against monetary policy of the ECB. That's the question you're asking. Okay. On the first, I have no hesitation in answering, as I just demonstrated on the issue of the interest rate for insurance companies, that the two institutions are independent, the SRB is fully credible, and so much so that it launched an inquiry into the consequences of the monetary policy taken by the ECB on the low interest rates for the industry. On the second point, my friend, I'm in your hands, so you decide about that.
Thank you. Now the last speaker is Werner Langen.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident. Sie haben, glaube ich, in der Arbeit keinen Zweifel an der Unabhängigkeit gelassen. Ich wundere mich im Nachhinein, warum dieses Gremium nicht bereits nach der Internetblase 2001 eingerichtet wurde. Denn danach haben die OTC-Derivate erst ihren Lauf begonnen. Ich habe zwei Fragen. Die erste aus der Runde vorher. Hat der Risikorat auch die Veränderungen im Währungsgefüge, etwa den allzu schnellen Sturz des Euros gegenüber Leitwährungen im letzten Jahr analysiert? Sie haben eben gesagt, geldpolitische Entscheidungen können auch Nebenwirkungen haben. Ich hätte gerne eine Antwort. Eben war die Zeit nicht ausreichend darauf. Und die zweite Frage betrifft die Frage, die Sie angesprochen haben hinsichtlich der Kapitalerhaltungsprogramme. Die EZB, und das ist ja dann auch Teil dieser Risikoanalyse, hat am 29. Januar 2015 den nationalen Aufsichtsbehörden Empfehlungen bezüglich der Dividende von nicht systemrelevanten Banken gegeben. Bei den systemrelevanten sehe ich das ein, auch was die Vergütungen angeht, die Variablen. Aber warum muss man den nicht systemrelevanten, etwa Genossenschaften, diese Vorgaben machen? Woran ist das orientiert, diese Risikobewertung, die nach meiner Meinung nicht notwendig ist? Und es ist nicht so, dass es nur eine Empfehlung ist, denn in ihrer eigenen Pressemeldung schreibt die EZB, Banken, deren Dividendenpolitik nicht der Empfehlung der EZB entspricht, müssen zusätzliche Informationen bereitstellen und ihre Gründe ausführlich erläutern. Es ist also mehr als nur eine Empfehlung. Danke.
Yeah, on the second question you asked, if I have understood it, which I'm not sure, but it seems to me it falls more in the competence of the SSM than in the SRB. But the broad issue is this, if I understand your question, which, as I said, I'm not sure. The broader question is basically, you want to make sure that banks have enough capital to carry out their lending activity on a sustainable basis. And in the past, supervisory authorities would never question things like compensation, salaries, wages of the bank managers, incentives, bonuses, and they would never question dividends. This was considered to fall within basically the shareholders' decision-making power. The supervisors had no say. But exactly because of what the effects that these two policies had during the crisis, because of what we have found out, that banks were weakened because of compensation policies or dividend policies, which were not right given the level of capital of these banks at that time. Or because, for the compensation, because of the bad incentives that certain compensation schemes had, now the supervisors have a say on both accounts. So you have both the SSM at central level and the national supervisors who've taken a stance, and they intervene actively in ruling over the dividends policies when banks are found to be having levels of capital that are not considered sufficient. Yeah, oh, the first question. On the first question, we currently don't have any work that's being planned. The reason is that exchange rates are the outcome not of one actor, not simply what the ECB does, but it's also what the other jurisdictions do. So exchange rates are the outcome of the combination of different business cycles and of different monetary policy cycles. Having said that, what is certainly worth looking into is not so much the level of certain exchange rates, but the speed with which exchange rates can fluctuate. And this can be actually having risks, carrying risks for financial stability. And we'll certainly look into this. I will ask the rest of the general of the board of the SRB whether it's willing to look into the financial stability risks of excessive volatility of the exchange rates. Incidentally, all the communique of the G7, G20 on exchange rates always make reference to avoiding excessive volatility in exchange rates or avoiding policies which generate excessive volatility. So the point is taken. Thank you.
Thank you very much to President Draghi for both very interesting, important exchange of view. We already basically defined at least part of the agenda of the next hearing in your capacity of ESRB. We identified very important items. So thank you very much. We can conclude this point of our agenda and have a 2-minute suspension.
Thank you. Right.